All right. Well, certainly thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be turning to Exodus chapter 25. Exodus chapter 25. This message number 32 in the series through Exodus, entitled Furniture. And we're going to be looking at this chapter in its entirety. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 to get started. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring me an offering. Of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart, ye shall take my offering. Now, chapter 24 ended the large section in Exodus that goes back to chapter 15 and verse number 22. And so that has mainly involved the giving of the covenant and the ratification of the covenant. That's what ends there in chapter 24. And we saw how that Israel, even in that chapter, twice swore an oath to obey God's covenant, that all the words that he has commanded that we will do, we will keep. And then Moses sprinkled the people, sprinkled them with the blood of the sacrifices, signifying obviously the cleansing necessary to enter into covenant with God, to have fellowship with him. And that was symbolized through the meal that took place on the mountain, the meal of fellowship there. And so Moses and the elders, those few that went up on the mountain, they saw a rare glimpse of Christ in his kingdom glory. And there's a few different times in the Bible that has been seen, but not very many, and not to very many people. So Moses was instructed afterward to come up the mountain alone, to meet God for 40 days and nights. And that's where chapter 25 picks up. And so really it starts the next large section of Exodus that goes through chapter 31. So in chapter 25 through chapter 31, all of this takes place on this 40 days and 40 nights that Moses is up on the mountain talking with God. Now, one of the reasons why that he was to go up there, of course, was to receive the stone tables or the stone tablets from God. And another was that he was to receive instructions concerning the tabernacle and various related items and services with the tabernacle, which was to be built afterward. So we have four main parts in this chapter. The first part in verses 1 to 9, which deals with the offering to the Lord. And then the next three parts all deal with these various items of furniture, as you want to call it, for the tabernacle. Verses 10 to 22 gives us the Ark of the Covenant. Verses 23 to 30, the table for the showbread. And verses 31 to 40, the lampstand for the tabernacle. And so we're going to try to work our way through these. We're going to begin with these offerings to the Lord. Let's begin here again in verse number 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying. Now, the opening phrase, the Lord spake unto Moses, or the Lord said to Moses. This precise phrase during this time of Moses on the mountain is repeated 6 more times after this. So you have it here, you have it in chapter 30, verse 11, verse 17, verse 22, verse 34, chapter 31, verse 1, and verse 12. So 7 times we have this reference to the Lord said, the Lord spoke, and he spoke to Moses. And really when we look at this 40 days of Moses on the mountain talking with God, we can see that it is patterned somewhat similarly to the very account of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, obviously, if we think about what happens here in terms of creation and what happened there, particularly afterward with the fall, then we can see that by this there's a signification of a movement toward restoring fellowship that was lost in the garden. So after Adam and Eve sinned, they were expunged from the garden. They were not able to re-enter into the garden, and they did not have the sort of fellowship where they walked daily with the Lord, talking with Him. They didn't have that sort of fellowship that they had once had, and so there was a rupture there between God and man because of the fall. And of course, we tracked all the way through Genesis, and God particularly revealing to Abraham and His covenant with Abraham how that He is going to restore that fellowship. But even there, the prophecy of Genesis 3:15 and the seed of the woman that's going to crush the head of the serpent, and all of those sort of things. Well, now we've come all of this way to this mountain that's covered in the cloud and the fire and everything, the people trembling at the base of it. And Moses is up there. He's covered in the cloud. He's in the midst of it on the mountain. And God is speaking to him. And we know that the result is going to be the building of this tabernacle, which, as we'll see momentarily, is a dwelling place for God with the nation Israel. So we're moving toward that restoration of fellowship between God and man. And we've already, of course, seen the necessity of the blood in that fellowship. Now, there are some other parallels as we look at this account, and I'm not really trying to track all of them, but there are a number of parallels. The creation account itself ends with God resting, that He worked for those days, making the creation, and then He rested on the seventh. And all of this tabernacle account here ends in chapter 31 with Sabbath instruction. The creation account ended with God inspecting His work and pronouncing it good and even blessing it. And likewise, at the end of the construction of the tabernacle, Moses inspects it and pronounces it good and blesses the people. And that's, of course, later in chapter 39, almost at the end of the book. So let's continue. Verses 2-7. Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring me an offering of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart. Ye shall take my offering. And this is the offering which ye shall take of them: gold and silver and brass and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen and goat's hair and ram's skin dyed red and badger skin and shittim wood, oil for the light, spices for anointing oil and for sweet incense, onyx stones and stones to be set in the ephod and in the breastplate. So Moses was to instruct Israel to bring their voluntary offerings unto him. So Moses was to collect these offerings, and he was to collect it from everyone who gave them willingly from the heart. That's what we are told there in verse number 2. And the fact that they gave willingly from the heart speaks, of course, that this was a free will offering. This wasn't the price of the firstborn or some of those things that God pronounced through His law that were required. This was a free will offering that they were to give. Everyone that gave it willingly. So giving it willingly from the heart meant that, on the one hand, they knew why they were giving. In other words, the motive that they had in giving what they gave. They knew why that they were doing it. They were also giving, and they were giving to the Lord. They weren't giving to Moses. In other words, they understood what this offering was for, what the purpose was. They were giving it to the Lord. They were giving it to be used as the Lord directed, and they were giving as an act of service and worship. Now, there will be more free will offerings and such things that take place in the law and throughout the history of Israel. And even some of these aspects picked up on in the New Testament related to our giving to the Lord today. They were able to give because they had obeyed God and spoiled the Egyptians so that they came out of Egypt with great wealth. And that goes all the way back to chapter 12, verses 35 and 36. And this was all done according to the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 and verse number 14, that they would come out with wealth. They would come out with great substance when He delivered them from their affliction and their oppression in the land that was not theirs. Now we have a listing here of various materials that were going to be used in the construction of the tabernacle and all of these things to make what God had instructed them to make. And a little more extensive list can be seen in chapter 35, and which we'll get there eventually. And some of the things that are mentioned here, and just to give an example, would be the 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 wood that is mentioned as we read throughout here, and sometimes translated acacia woods. Sometimes people have given different ideas of what this type of, and the truth of it is that we don't know for certain really exactly what tree this was being referred to. And there's going to be a number of things like that as you read through these descriptions. There's just a number of things we're not really going to be able to be certain about exactly what it was, exactly what it looked like, but we certainly have the record for a reason. Verses 8 and 9. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. So the purpose now was given. The purpose of this free will offering from the people was in order to make a sanctuary for the Lord. And the word that's used there essentially means a consecrated place. This isn't a common place that they were making. This is a consecrated place that they were making. It was a set apart place, particularly, God says, for him to dwell with and to meet with Israel. Now, it was to be made after the pattern of the tabernacle that it was to be made. And the word there refers to a form or even to a model. And again, if we think about back in creation and how that man was made in the image of God, well, in the making of the tabernacle, it was actually made in the image of the heavenly tabernacle. Now, the writer of Hebrews refers to this fact a couple of different times. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For, see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. Chapter 9, verses 21 to 24. Moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Now, what can I tell you about this heavenly tabernacle? Well, not a lot. Not really a lot. But all we can know is that there is some sort of heavenly tabernacle that was shown to Moses that this earthly tabernacle was a model of. It was a replica of. And that model, the writer of Hebrews said, had to be sprinkled with the blood of the bulls and the goats and what have you. But the heavenly tabernacle, he said, had to be sprinkled with something better than what the earthly was. The heavenly is the real, is what the writer of Hebrews is telling us. The earthly is just the shadow. It's just the model. It's just a replica. But the heavenly is the real place. Now, we're not given a lot of explanation. So as we start going through this and with the tabernacle and with the furniture and all of these things, we are not given a lot of explanation. Now, and some of you may have, especially if you've got maybe study Bible, sometimes they have some sketches or diagrams or even some pictures of things and trying to liken that. And so we can get maybe something of an idea about some of these things, but we really don't know. And so we want to just avoid sort of fanciful speculation about these things, but we are about to get into these descriptions here, beginning with verse 10, where we get the first item for the tabernacle, that Ark of the Covenant or Ark of the Testimony. Verses 10 to 16 here. And they shall make an ark of shittim wood, 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and a cubit and a half the breadth thereof, and a cubit and a half the height thereof. And thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, within and without shalt thou overlay it, and shalt make upon it a crown of gold round about. And thou shalt cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in the 4 corners thereof. And 2 rings shall be in the one side of it, and 2 rings in the other side of it. And thou shalt make staves of shittim wood, and overlay them with gold. And thou shalt put the staves into the rings by the sides of the ark, that the ark may be borne with them. The staves shall be in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And thou shalt put into the ark the testimony which I shall give thee. So the ark was essentially a wooden rectangular box. And from the dimensions that were given here, we could say that it's probably somewhere around 3.5 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and about 2.5 feet high. We're told that it was overlaid with pure gold, which would have been a refined gold, a gold refined of impurities. And it would have been, this wood would have been overlaid inside and out. So the entirety of it was essentially golden on the outside with this overlay. And they were to make these 4 golden rings as well. And they would be in the corners of this on the outside so that it could be carried with these poles that they were made of wood. And then they were also overlaid with gold. And so they would be able to stick them through the rings and to be able to carry and transport the Ark of the Covenant. And one of the things that you notice immediately is how that everything was made portable. Everything was made so that it could be transported, it could be moved. The tabernacle itself, as we later get the descriptions of it, it was made so that it could be taken down and moved and put back up and all these sort of things. And so the idea of this being made portable gives us a couple of indications. One of those being is that this was the place where God was going to dwell with and meet with Israel. So it's not only here in this mountain. It's not only here in Mount Sinai does the Lord come down, or does the Lord have power, or does he have some sort of reign? But wherever that they were to go, he would go with them. And it also foreshadows their time in the wilderness, because they're going to be moving around quite a bit for a number of years, 40 years before they even come into the promised land. Now, obviously, the intention is later there would be a more permanent place and situation, because still as of yet, the Lord hasn't revealed to them where he has set his name, where that the tabernacle and ultimately the temple was to be and where they were to assemble. Verses 17 to 22. And thou shalt make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and a cubit and a half the breadth thereof. And thou shalt make the 2 cherubims of gold. Of beaten work shalt thou make them in the 2 ends of the mercy seat. And make 1 cherub on the one end, and the other cherub on the other end. Even of the mercy seat shall you make the cherubims on the 2 ends thereof. And the cherubims shall stretch forth their wings on high, covering the mercy seat with their wings. And their faces shall look one to another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubims be. And thou shalt put the mercy seat above upon the ark, and in the ark thou shalt put the testimony that I shall give thee. And there I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubims, which are upon the ark of the testimony, of all things which I will give thee in commandment unto the children of Israel. So this mercy seat that is described is a lid that was made for this ark. Remember, the ark is a rectangular box, and so the lid would have been a rectangular lid that would fit on top of the ark. The lid itself was to be made of pure gold. It wasn't overlaid wood. It was to be made of pure gold. And incorporated into the lid were to be these cherubims that were of gold. They were the way it's described is that they were to be of one piece with it. So all of this cherubims and the lid and everything that was there was all to be made of one piece. And these cherubims had wings that were outstretched and covering over the lid, and they were facing each other, that we are told. Now, again, when it comes to the cherubims, for instance, these are some sort of what we would think of as angelic beings. Um, we get we get appearances of cherubim at different times in the Bible, and usually there's not a lot of description that is given for them, and sometimes the description seems to pick up on different things, and even sometimes they are described as sort of being some sort of composite type beings that they don't entirely look human, but they're not and there's various parts of them. You so we don't know exactly what this looked like when they made this lid and these cherubims with the wings outstretched and such. We don't know exactly what that looked like, but we do know the purpose of it. It was to cover the ark because the stone tables were to be put inside, and there's other things added later as well. But the stone tablets were to be put inside, and between the cherubim is really where the significance is, because that is where the Shekinah glory of God's presence would dwell, there over the ark. In other words, when His glory would fill the tabernacle, that is where His presence would dwell. In verses 23 to 30, we have the table of showbread. Thou shalt also make a table of shittim wood. 2 cubits shall be the length thereof, and a cubit of the breadth thereof, and a cubit and a half their height thereof. Thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, and make thereto a crown of gold round about. And thou shalt make unto it a border of an handbreadth round about. And thou shalt make a golden crown to the border thereof and round about. And thou shalt make for it 4 rings of gold, and put the rings in the 4 corners that are on the 4 feet thereof. Over against the border shall the rings be for the places of the staves to bear the table. And thou shalt make the staves of shittim wood, and overlay them with gold, and that the table may be borne with them. And thou shalt make the dishes thereof, and the spoons thereof, and the covers thereof, and the bowls thereof, to cover withal of pure gold shalt thou make them. And thou shalt set upon the table showbread before me always. So the table of showbread, again, was made of wood, like the ark. The dimensions that we are given here would make it about 3 feet long, about 1.5 feet wide, and about 2.5 feet tall. It was overlaid, again, with pure gold, that refined gold. It had 4 rings of gold that were made. These were put at the 4 corners at the legs so that, again, it could be carried with the poles that were made for it. And we also get a description of some of these utensils that went along with this table, and they were to be made of gold as well. And then we read that the showbread was to be set upon the table. So every week, the priests were to lay 12 fresh loaves of bread on the table in the holy place in the tabernacle. And then each week, each weekly Sabbath, the priests on duty would eat the showbread that had been placed there the previous Sabbath. And it is sometimes referred to as the bread of the presence. Now, what this bread signified was indeed God's presence with Israel, God's provision for Israel. And the eating of it signified fellowship with Him. Now, there were obviously 12 loaves for the 12 tribes of Israel, and we will see sort of that number and the significance of that appear again and again, reading through these things in the Pentateuch. And then we get to the last article here in this chapter. That's the golden lampstand or candlestick as it's given here. Verses 31 to 36. And thou shalt make a candlestick of pure gold, of beaten work shall the candlestick be made. His shaft and his branches, his bowls, his knops, and his flowers shall be of the same. And 6 branches shall come out of the sides of it, 3 branches of the candlestick out of the one side, and 3 branches of the candlestick out of the other side. 3 bowls made like unto almonds, with a knop and a flower in one branch, and 3 bowls made like almonds in the other branch, with a knop and a flower. So in the 6 branches that come out of the candlestick. And in the candlestick shall be 4 bowls made like unto almonds, with their knops and their flowers. And there shall be a knot under two branches of the same, and a knot under two branches of the same, and a knot under two branches of the same, according to the 6 branches that proceed out of the candlestick. Their knops and their branches shall be of the same, and it shall be one beaten work of pure gold. So again, of course, we have this word here is translated candlestick. I think some of the newer translations use maybe lampstand. Obviously, it wasn't a candlestick as we think of candlesticks, but was more of a lampstand. And the word used here actually is a menorah, is what was made. And it was patterned after a flowering almond tree. That's essentially what it was to look like. So we've got a sort of a main trunk that goes up, and then you have 6 branches on each side, and they've got these flowers and cups and things there. And really, if you go through and you count it all up, you have essentially 69 ornaments in the fashioning, the making of this particular thing. 6 branches, 3 cups, 4 cups, and the bud, and all of these things that are to resemble this flowering almond tree. And it seems like from some of the things that I've read that later on, at some point in Israel's history, the idea of the 69 ornaments on this menorah wasn't quite satisfactory, and so the Jews added 1 piece to it to make it 70, and that was a much better and more significant number. Now, again, I've read that in several places, and I don't really know the history of all of that. Verses 37 to 40. And thou shalt make the 7 lamps thereof, and they shall light the lamps thereof, that they may give light over against it. And the tongs thereof and the snuff dishes thereof shall be of pure gold. Of a talent of pure gold shall he make it with all these vessels. And look that thou make them after their pattern, which was showed thee in the mount. Now, this lampstand, this menorah, was to stand on the other side of the tabernacle from the table of showbread, and it was to be kept supplied with pure olive oil, that it would burn and that it would not go out. And it gave light to the priests, obviously engaged in their service within the tabernacle. We're told that the gold required to make this all of one piece was a talent, and I've seen a talent in weight being figured somewhere between 75 to 100 pounds. So pretty significant piece that was made here for the tabernacle. And again, they were told that they were to ensure that everything was made according to the pattern. Moses had some sight that was given him of the heavenly tabernacle, and everything was to be made according to what it was that he was shown. Now, as we think about this, and we're just getting into this time, this 40 days and nights, we've got more to go, and the tabernacle and all the things related to it, we notice that we're already picking up on this repeated emphasis that there was a pattern shown to Moses, and what was made was a model of it, was a replica of it. And the emphasis on this pattern, it was significant. But again, we aren't given explanation. We aren't given to be able to know exactly for certain what these things were and what they looked like. Now, later writers actually referred to these things as a shadow, and you can see that like in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 5. Paul refers to some of those shadowy things in his letter to the Colossians. And even what we know about them is somewhat shadowy when you think about it, because we really don't have a full, clear. And I know that there have been models that have been made, and graphics that have been done and I'm not saying anything against those things. I'm just saying we don't know for certain. There's a representation there, and we can say, well, this it might have been something like this is probably about what we can do. So it is certainly shadowy, but really, when you think about it, that sort of goes along with the purpose of all of these things. The purpose of all of these things was to be a shadow. It was only to give us a likeness. It wasn't to give us the true image. So reading this, we can tell that this isn't written to us as a guide or an instruction manual for building a tabernacle. And I know that there's been some models constructed and things like that, and even like with the the life-size ark that was done and with Answers in Genesis and such. And still a lot of, and they tell you when you go through and tour that, they go through and tell you there's a lot of details we don't have, but thinking of what they had and what was available and what was needed, we think it would have been something like this. And it's really about the best that we can do when it comes to the tabernacle and some of these things. This isn't given to us so that we can go out back here in the field and build a tabernacle exactly like this. It's not why it's given to us. And really, when you read through this, and this is one of those places that can be hard reading, because sometimes, and even as I understand it, even some of the words, they're translated differently because we're not exactly sure what those words meant, what exactly they were describing. So how are we going to liken it to something in English? And it's not always an easy thing to do. This isn't about the materials. This isn't about the building, the structure of the tabernacle itself. Really, the significance is in the purpose. It's the reason why they were building the tabernacle. That is what is truly important. Now, obviously, it had to be made. It had to be done the way that God said for it to be done. I'm not saying that's not important, but this was a meeting place. This was a holy place where God would dwell with his nation on the earth. So the point was not the building and such of a structure and of articles of furniture, but the purpose was worship. The purpose was service. The purpose was fellowship. The purpose was obeying God's word. And of course, ultimately, we learn in the New Testament that the tabernacle and all its furniture and services was a shadow of the true tabernacle. And it is actually intended to point us to Jesus Christ. And that's what we must get out of this reading. And again, we got quite a few chapters of this ahead of us before we finish on the book of Exodus. But we want to maintain that understanding as what was the purpose and what is it pointing us to? What is it saying to us? All right, that's all the message for this morning. So we will close with a hymn.